Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our MPC Online Bible Study. I am Matthew McGlade, the lead and teaching pastor here at Mansfield Pentecostal Church, where every Tuesday night we have a thought to think about, a question to ponder, a text to study. And as you know, last few weeks we've been doing a Bible study series, journeying through the Hebrew Bible, where we're going through all the individual books of the Old Testament and we're looking at their application into the Christian life. We recently looked at books of Genesis and Exodus and Leviticus. And you remember that last week when we're looking at Leviticus, we're looking at the central importance of holiness, that God is a holy God, that He wants us to be holy. The holiness impacts upon every aspect of our life. But what we're going to be doing tonight, we're going to start to delve into the book of Numbers. And next week, we're then going to look at the book of Deuteronomy. And the main thing we're going to find out about these two books is how our obedience to God is important, that determines how far we move on in the plan and the purpose that God has for us, and in inheriting His promises for us in this lifetime. And so that's what we're going to be looking at. And so we see, as we looked at last week, after the Israelites had arrived at Mount Sinai and God gives them His law, and we saw last week that God gave instructions for a tabernacle to be built, or a tent to be built, for His presence to dwell in the center of the community. What we see here is that God gives instructions for the Israelites to move from Mount Sinai, or from Mount Horeb, to a place called Kadesh Barnea, which is on the edge of the promised land. And that journey should have taken them 11 days to do that journey. But an 11-day journey actually ended up taking them 40 years. And the reason it took them for so long to take such a short journey was because God's people refused to believe the promise that He had for them. And in fact, had the Israelites responded in obedience to God right from the very beginning and believed in the promises of God, we would not have actually had the book of Deuteronomy. Because the book of Deuteronomy was given for a second generation of Israelites to remind them of God's law and God's promises. And so, just to give us an idea of who actually wrote the book of Numbers and Deuteronomy, it was actually Moses. And we know this because at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, we see that God gave Moses some instructions to record the history of the children of Israel and their wanderings in the wilderness. And so, and also when we come to the book of Deuteronomy itself, it's very clear that Moses wrote that book as well before handing it over to his assistant Joshua. And so what we're going to do tonight, we're going to look at the story of Numbers, and we're also going to look at two parts. We're going to break Numbers into three parts. We're going to look at two of those parts tonight, and the last part we're going to look at next week, while we also look at the book of Deuteronomy as well. So as indicated by the title, the book of Numbers is a book about numbers, okay? And in fact, it's a book of two censuses that was made of the Israelites before and after their wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. And so the first census was carried out before the Israelites went to the edge of the promised land. And in that census, all the men 20 years age or older who were able to fight were counted in the census, and that first census came to 603,550 men, okay? So that was the number for the first census. The second census, which was carried out 40 years later, of all the men 20 years of age or older, came to 601,730. And so the story of Numbers tells what happened in between those two censuses, okay? And we see that God, as I mentioned, after He brought them out of Egypt, He took them to Mount Sinai. God instructed Moses for a census to be carried out, and then a generation later, a second census was carried out. And so we see that first generation that I mentioned, that first census was carried out, they ended up missing out on the promise that God had for them to move into the promised land and to take hold of the promise that God had for them. Now we mustn't forget something. This is the generation that saw the signs and wonders of God. They saw God sending the plagues upon Egypt. They saw the Lord parting the Red Sea. They saw God's provision with the manna. And yet, in spite of all of that, they saw God appearing on the mountain and the voice of God speaking when the 10 Commandments were given. And yet, this generation refused to believe God. They knew of God, but they didn't know God personally. They had an awareness of God, but they didn't actually trust God. And so that 11-day journey that took them to the promised land actually took them 40 years. And God was so disappointed at that generation that whole generation missed out on the promise that God had for them to step into the promise, and that whole generation died off, with the exception of 2 men. One was a man by the name of Joshua, and the other was a man by the name of Caleb, who we'll come back to later. And so that first generation actually left a spiritual debt or a natural debt to the second generation, because the second generation should have been in the promised land, and they should have been building on the gains of their parents, their ancestors, and the promise that God had for them. So actually they left a debt to the second generation. And so the second generation started where the first generation should have completed, as it were. And so what we're going to do, we're going to just look at 2 parts of the book of Numbers tonight, and then we'll look at the next part next week. And the first part, we're going to look at the preparation of Sinai, which we see in chapters 1 to 10. After God gives his people his laws in the book of Leviticus and Exodus of how he wants them to live, to be a holy people, after he gives the instructions about the tabernacle, about God's presence living amongst them, and the importance of the priesthood, of making sacrifices to atone for the sin of the people, God says, right, you guys are basically a disorganized, motley bunch of people, and we need to organize you into a fighting force before you could go into the land that I've promised. And so God says to Moses that the Israelites are to be arranged according to the tribal divisions. Each tribal division is to have a tribal leader, and they'd be arranged in an orderly fashion around the tabernacle of God, which is to be at the very center of the community. In and around the tabernacle of God is a specific tribe called the tribe of Levi. And remember from last week, from the book of Leviticus, the Levites were responsible for ministering into the presence of God. And only one clan amongst the Levites, or the one family of the Levites, the descendants of Aaron, were allowed to minister into the very presence of God. And so the Levites had a very important status in looking after the things of God. They were appointed by God to tend to the things of God. Now, there were 3 specific clans of the Levites that had specific responsibilities. There was a clan of Levites called the Kohathites, and their responsibility was to look after the articles inside the tabernacle. So remember last week we talked about the bronze altar, the bronze sea. We looked at the Ark of God's Covenant and the mercy seat. We looked at the table of incense and all these things. The Kohathites were responsible for carrying these items and looking after them. Then there was another clan of the Levites, were the Gershonites, and what they were responsible for looking after the tent itself. And then the Merarites were a clan of the Levites who were responsible for looking after the frames and the posts when the Israelites would move from one place to another. And so the Levites, the Levite tribe, were at the very center of the camp where God's tabernacle was. And now what we see around the center of the camp where God's tabernacle was were various tribes. And God instructed that the tribes were to be arranged around the center in a particular order. To the east, there were 3 tribes, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun, with Judah being the lead tribe. To the south, there were another 3 tribes that were camped, Reuben, Simeon, and Gad. Okay, with Simeon, as far as I recall, being the lead tribe for that. To the west were the tribes of Ephraim, Manasseh, and Benjamin. Okay, and Ephraim and Manasseh were the descendants of Joseph, And all those tribes were the descendants of Jacob's wife Rachel, and they were to the west. And then to the north were the tribes of Dan, Asher, and Naphtali. And so when the tabernacle was built, when God arranged the tribes around the tabernacle, what we need to understand is that 2 years had passed now since God had brought the Israelites out of Egypt. And so on the second Passover, after the Israelites had came out of Egypt, they were now ready to start to go into the promised land and take hold of God's promises for his people. And the way this would work is that God's presence, remember last week we said that the presence of God was in the mountain, okay? Now that God's presence had moved from the mountain into the tabernacle. Now God is at the center of his people, at the community of his people. And when God wanted to instruct his people to move, what would happen was that God would lead the way. And so we see that the cloud of God's presence will rise from the tabernacle, okay? And then the trumpet would signal, and that was a clear signal to inform the Israelites to move camp. And then what would happen first was that the eastern tribes would first move. So God's presence would rise in a pillar of fire by night and a cloud by day. It would go before the Israelite camp, and then the eastern tribes would go. Judah, with Judah leading the way. After the tribe of Judah, the Gershonites and the Merarites, who are the clans of Levi, they would dismount the tent or the tabernacle, the tent, the fabrics and the poles and the frames, and they would follow the eastern tribes led by Judah. Then after that, the southern unit of tribes led by Simeon would follow, and the Kohathites, who are the other clan of Levites, who carry the Ark of the Covenant and carry the gold table and the incense altar and the bronze altar, they would follow the southern unit of tribes. And then after that, the rest of the Levites were followed by the remaining tribes of Israel from the western unit of tribes, the tribes of Joseph and the northern units as well. And so what we see is this: there was an orderliness in how God wanted his people to move. And actually there's a Christian application for us today, because amongst God's people today, his church, there is an orderliness in how we do things. There's an orderliness in how we conduct our worship before God. Paul talks about this in 1 Corinthians 14, about everything being in an orderly way and how we minister in God's presence and use the gifts of the Spirit. And so the first part of Deuteronomy, chapters 1 and 10, is about the preparation in Sinai, and the message is about an orderliness in how God's people conduct ourselves in moving forward. When we come to the second part of Deuteronomy, chapters 11 to 20, this is where it all gets interesting, because this is actually about the disobedience in the desert. And God leads his people from Sinai to Kadesh Barnea, and it was an 11-day journey to the edge of the promised land. And a number of incidences occur during this 11-day journey which highlight some issues where this community are having to get used to the fact that they are living with a holy God, and that God is holy and that he wants them to be holy. There's a couple of lessons in particular that we learn. The first one is a lesson in gratitude. Right from the very beginning, the Israelites start to complain about their hardships in the wilderness. Rather than giving thanks to God, they're complaining. And as a result, because they're living with a holy God, campfires start to ensue around the camp, and some people die as a result of those campfires. Then the rabble, as the Bible describes them, complain about the miraculous supply of food that God was giving them every day. Every day that God was giving them manna, this mysterious bread that would appear. And they were complaining about it, complaining at God's provision, saying, we wish we had the melons and the cucumbers that we had in Egypt. And they failed to understand that actually their complaining was actually against God. And so Moses, by this stage, he's trying to look after 2.5 million people here, and he's having a nervous breakdown. And he prays the pastor's secret prayer, saying, God, I've had enough. I can't be having this anymore. I can't carry the weight of these people anymore. Will you just please end my life? And the Lord responds to Moses. And God says, listen, I want you to appoint 72 elders from the community. And the spirit that I've put on you, I'm going to put on those elders. And they're going to help me to carry the weight of leading these people. And so that's what Moses does. And during that time, God also sends some quail, some birds to fall onto the camp so that people can also have some meat to eat as well as the manna. And the Bible says that while they were eating the meat, that God actually sent a plague amongst them because God was so angry at their complaining. And so we see there's a lesson of gratitude from the Israelites that we can learn. The second lesson that we can learn from them during this time in the wilderness is a lesson on faith. God brings them to the edge of the promised land, and we see that they ask or request, the people ask to send spies out into the land to spy out the land so they know the lay of the land, so they know how to attack and take hold of the land. And so the spies go out in the land, and God gives them permission to do this. And when the spies come back, rather than giving, and there were 12 spies, one from each of the 12 tribes of Israel, rather than giving a faith-filled report of what God can do through them in taking hold of the land, they came back with a bad report. And they said, listen, the land is good, okay? But we can't take the land because they said there were giants in the land. And we were like grasshoppers in our own eyes. And we'll be destroyed by them, and we won't be able to take hold of the land that God has promised us. And so they refused to believe God's promise. And the result of their unbelief is that it spread discouragement amongst the people of God, and it also brought about disobedience. And so this bad report culminated in unbelief in the promises of God. But the only spies who did believe that they could take the land was, of course, Joshua and Caleb. And so they spread a bad report amongst the community. And the whole community complained, they wailed, they moaned. They said, why have you, Moses, brought us out the promised land, out of Egypt? Have you led us here to die? How can we possibly move into the promise that we were meant to have? And at this point, this really was the last straw for God. God says, right, that's it. I've had enough. Okay, turn around and go back out into the wilderness. And every one of you who said that you will die in the promised land, you can't take the promised land because of your unbelief. Every one of you will die in the wilderness for the next 40 years. And your children, whom you said will be slaves, well, actually, they will be the ones who will go in and take the promised land. Only, God says, Joshua and Caleb, who believe in my promises, they will be the only ones who will step into the promised land. And so the 10 spies who brought the bad report amongst the people, they will immediately die. God killed them immediately. And so what happened was that many people, when they heard God say this, they wailed, they moaned, they complained. They said, no, God, we'll do what you want us to do. And in presumption, some of them went up into the promised land to try and take it, but they were defeated by the Amalekites and the Canaanites, because God was not going with them. God said, listen, you have not believed in me, and I am not going with you. My presence will not go with you. And so the message was very clear, that if the Israelites were to take hold of God's promise for them, they had to believe in his promise. And they missed on the opportunity that God had for them to enter into the land. And so instead, God says it will be your children who go there instead. Now there's a lesson and a half, isn't there, for us here as Christians when it comes to stepping into God's promises. The writer of Hebrews explains that they failed to enter into God's rest or to God's promise because of their unbelief. And the same is true for us in our Christian life. We can fail to enter into the promises that God has for us, both in this life and I also think in the next life as well, because of unbelief. we've got to put our trust ongoingly, our confidence in God, if we're to live in the promises that God has for our life, both in this life and in this and in the next life. And so, so the writer of Hebrews makes the point, and he says that we would need to see to it that none of you has a sinful, unbelieving heart that turns away from the living God. And so, for us as Christians today, we need to take a lesson from the Israelites and their wandering in the wilderness. An 11-day journey, a journey that should have taken 11 days, took them 40 years because of their unbelief and disobedience. May we, as God's people, trust in God, believe in the promises that He has for us, and step out in faith in what God is telling us and showing us to do, and trust in Him to step into the promises that God has for us. God says, I'll never leave you or forsake you. That I am with you all the way. And because of the work that Christ has done for us on our behalf, we can step into God's promises with a sense of confidence. However, we also need to take warning from the story of the Israelites. In fact, Paul mentioned this when he was writing to the Corinthians. He explained that these things happened to them as examples and were written down as warnings for us, on whom the culmination of the ages has come. And so the story of the Israelites in the wilderness and the wandering in the wilderness and the failure of that first generation to take hold of God's promise was written for our benefit, so that we can learn to step in to the fullness of what God has for our lives. Well, next week we're going to look a little bit more in Numbers, and we're also going to look particularly at the book of Deuteronomy. Well, guys, that's a thought to think about. A question to ponder is this: how does the story of the Israelites' 40-year journey challenge you to reflect on areas of your life where you may be struggling to trust God and to obey Him? So how does the story of the Israelites and the 40-year journey challenge you to reflect on areas of your life where you may be struggling to trust and struggling with trust and obedience to God? And a text study, I'd like you to read Hebrews chapter 3 verse to 12. Hebrews chapter 3 verses 7 to 12 we should say. What parallels can you draw between the Israelites' unbelief and the challenges you face in trusting God today? How can you actively work to cultivate a heart of belief and obedience in your walk with God? Guys, hope you got something out of that. Hey, listen, have a great rest of the week, and looking forward to seeing you at the weekend. God bless you all.